as a total rupture. This poses problems for Badiou's meta-ontological discourse in Being an Event, as there can be no support for a figure of the event in ontology, which is not a figure of transcendence. Badiou is well aware of this problem and is quick to ward off via meta-ontological criticism leftist deviations which draw their power from the presentation of the event as total rupture, total lacuna. He names such a deviation in Being an Event speculative leftism, but ostensibly he can't cash out those criticisms in Being an Event in a determinate way because he's still within the ontological discourse. So he kind of attests, wants to talk about the in a determinate way, the way that an event is not just a total rupture, but there's a kind of a determinate structure and the introduction of the event in a new form of consistency that's, yeah.
I've been informed that your microphone is still on mute, and so it's not actually being recorded.
Okay.
So, here. Which one is that? Is that the, hold on.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's the one in your breast pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that one or the, or is it this one?
Do you want to come in? Yeah.
Yeah.
Now it should be working.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
I'll keep going.
Yeah, just go. I mean,
Yeah.
people will figure it out.
Yeah, and Badiou, within the ontological discourse, which is set theoretic in Being an Event, Badiou has this meta-ontological criticism of the kind of leftism which could draw its power from this total rupture, but he can't cash these out. And one of the reasons for writing Logics of Worlds is really an attempt to give an account of the coming to be determinate of the complete ruptural, dislocated point of the event. But confined to ontology, the event can only be decided. Contracted into a point, the situation can support no determinate diagonal between the generic being of a truth and the absistent event. Worse still, the pains Badiou goes to reiterating these criticisms to the opposite seem an imposition on the mathematical discourse by philosophy, which is ostensibly something that Badiou doesn't want to do in his kind of encounter with set theoretic discourse. Brassier is right to say that the axiomatic consistency of ontological discourse encounters its own impossibility in the event. In other words, the ontological a priori discourse intersects with the a posteriori, the world, at the point where the effectuation of the inconsistency of consistency, the being nothing of non-being, flips over into an effectuation of the consistency of inconsistency, the non-being of being nothing, or subjective truth, through the mediation of the event. Rorty's optimism regarding the transition of analytic philosophy from its Kantian to its Hegelian phase, from Sellars to McDowell and Brandom, draws some of its support from the latter's abandonments of picturing. Extricated from an intelligible and hence practicable relationship between the discursive and its outside, pragmatism becomes a garden blooming with different varieties of, I think, what Badiou terms democratic materialisms. It's in this respect that we should reverse the traditional designations of left and right Sellarsians. Those who privilege non-naturalism, a non-naturalism of the space of reasons, who side with the global sense and the integration of structure, they're on the right. Brandam's metaphor in this respect in The Spirit of Trust is overtly common legalistic. It's about the integration for the privileging of the consistency of structural discursive activity over the possible introduction of new reasons. You can even see this in Sellars, the notion that there is an ultimate defeasibility of all claims, but not all at once. In a sense, there's even within Sellars, you can see the justification or the moment of a kind of rightism in that respect. On the other hand, those who privilege the productivity of scientific practice upon the space of reasons, who side with local configurations and the differential of the encounter of the discursive with its material underbelly, they're on the left. And it's strange that Rorty, there's a kind of account of the left and the right within Badiou that maps these two accents of Sellars onto the precise opposite terms. I'll now kind of go into more of a extemporaneous thing. I guess there's a common criticism of Badiou. Certainly, people like Brassier reiterate this, someone like Hallward as well. And it was very much there in the criticism Badiou received after being Event 1 that essentially there's no real connection of the purely subtracted from any phenomenal appearing account of being that Badiou gives in being Event 1. And the reason why I think there can be a kind of productive relationship between pragmatism, which is something like the formalization or a real thought of a kind of topic that Badiou isn't interested or doesn't care about. The notion of empirical experience or phenomenal experience and kind of everyday just discursive practice that can kind of supplement and make make determinate or intelligible at the level of empirical experience these kind of purely formal modes in Badiou's ontology. Ostensibly, as I was saying, Logics of Worlds was meant to serve this function, and Badiou gives a account moving from the resources of set theory to the resources of category and topos theoretic concepts, which kind of has arrived historically, especially through the work of Grothendieck, the most general concept we have of logical space, which is a topos. And it's funny because this move by Badiou, moving from the pure a subtraction, in a sense, of ontology from any phenomenal mode, to this discourse about the situatedness of beings in a world, in Logics of Worlds, has received criticisms from both someone like Brassier, who a few years ago was much more enamored with the kind of death blow that being an Event 1 serves to any notion of the connection between the real and the phenomenal, the real and any empirical articulation of the real. And there's this refrain of Brassier's, and it's echoed in, I'm thinking of another commentator, I can't remember, that it's a shame that Badiou, in a sense, has moved to this kind of discourse in Logics of Worlds. It's a shame that he's not carried to the end the complete subtraction of the real from any notion of phenomenal experience. And then on the other hand, you have commentators like Hallward in his article Order and Event, who essentially criticized Badiou from the other way around, saying that this is what we needed to make intelligible and practicable the support of truth in ontological discourse that was present in Being an Event, but it doesn't succeed. There's still something missing, in fact, between linking the kind of asubjective, adiscursive appearance of beings in Logics of Worlds to a notion of practice, to a notion of individuals, ultimately, for Hallward, certainly, is what Badiou was meant to provide. And again, if there can be some rapprochement between, again, my kind of positing of pragmatism as being such a discourse about the possible articulation of the individual situated in social discursive practice that can touch, in a sense, more on the left Sellarsian side, the real, then we can kind of supplement or give an account of that process. I'll just kind of end with some short questions, in a sense. Sorry, 1 second. That I think it would be interesting to talk about. I'm very much convinced that the philosophy of science, I mean, Sellars is always very quick to draw the connection between philosophy of science and kind of broader philosophical themes. It's my view that pragmatism doesn't have a very well-formulated philosophy of science. I mean, the notion, like the Peircean notion of a kind of intertheoretic distance can't be understood. I think the quantitative notion of measuring intertheoretic distance by what, in a sense, there's some kind of measurement, a discrepancy. They would predict different measurements at the level of the observable, which is a mathematical concept, the observable. It's like that doesn't give us at all any purchase on a determinate understanding of the real conceptual structure and conceptual articulation of scientific theories. It's many steps removed from such an account. And obviously it's, for that reason, you start talking about what should be a discussion on the scientific concepts in terms of the notion of the limit and of convergence, which are interesting themes about scientific conceptualization, but you've collapsed and are kind of talking about them through maybe misapplied or misexported mathematical concepts in that particular way. And obviously I didn't really mention this, but Badiou, it's coming from a completely different tradition of the philosophy of science, one that's really not received at all in Anglo-American philosophy until quite recently. The only commentator I'm aware who writes something close to primary works on French philosophy of science, someone like David Corfield, in the Anglophone world as such. Yeah, I think I'll end at that, but yeah, thank you.
getting at the traditional philosophy of science that is informing Badiou's work.
Yeah.
Can you just say more about that tradition and what Badiou is making of it or doing with it?
Yeah, so it kind of, I'm by no means an expert on it. There are experts. I mean, it's a very productive area of research within Europe itself, still now, and there's translation work going on. But it kind of starts with French neo-Kantianism in the turn of the 20th century, figures like Brunswick, and there's a sense that this continues in what's called the School of French Historical Epistemology, which is kind of an institutional research program in a sense. There's a kind of unity of a school of French historical epistemology. The central figures, you kind of have this, the period, but it's Bachelard, Alain, Metzger, Canguilhem, there's more minor figures and this kind of thing. And it's a completely different, I think, articulation of an understanding of the scientific process. I'm not sure it's correct to characterize it as a kind of privileging a discontinuity over continuity within the history of the sciences, but that's certainly a theme. And it's really the wellspring of Badiou's confidence with regards to his designation and understanding of the sciences, which not only informs the philosophy in terms of this appropriation of mathematical discourse for philosophy, but also it heavily informs his account of what people are doing when they are not just doing science, but these other regions of activity. Badiou wants to think about politics, art, and love/psychoanalysis. And yeah, there's very little crosstalk historically, and it's a shame because there should be yeah. Thank you.
One quick follow-up. This continuity that you mentioned is what, between the different scientific disciplines or between the sciences and other accounts?
So both. I mean, on the one hand, there's the notion, there's a very strong theme of the non-unity of the sciences. It's the sciences and not, in fact, science. There's, as well, the notion of kind of a discontinuity in quite a radical sense between the so-called succession of theories. To less or more extent, I mean, there's certainly figures within the tradition. I'm thinking particularly of Albert Lautmann, who is a philosopher and historian of mathematics primarily, who wants to think of some notion of continuity at the level of a kind of there's a kind of overarching system of like oppositions and idealities that, while at the level of individual theories, there's a kind of discontinuity. It's like a lighthouse, kind of throwing some kind of more determination, or even an expression of some fundamental continuous themes in the history of mathematics. But this is a very different way of conceiving of the continuity of scientific theories, certainly compared to Peirce, but yeah.
Yeah, I have a quick, it's kind of more clarification on what you wanted to do in your presentation. Like, from what I understand, you're criticizing what we call usually left Sellarsianism from the point of view of the Badiouian, the tradition from that Badiou stems from. I was thinking it was unclear to me whether you think there is something to be gained from the Badiouian side in engaging with the Sellars one, or maybe just the right Sellars, or what we call that you are rightfully questioning, what we call the right Sellars one.
Yeah.
Just I wanted to be clear on that. What's your position on that point specifically?
To be gained from the left Salesian in the normal.
To be gained from the right Salesian camp, because I don't take it.
Yeah.
I take it that you don't think there's much to be gained from the left Salesian camp. But that maybe I'm mistaken.
Yeah, I mean now I've confused myself by re-articulating those terms. But
yeah, just because you switch the roles.
Well, I guess certainly on the left, I taken in its traditional designation, I think there is something to be gained. I mean, if basically, but we should place them correctly. The kind of Brandomian vision of like the interiority and of discursivity to itself, in a sense, where there's this primacy of the consistency of structure. I don't think that's an inadequate account of certain regions of the world or certain regions of activity. It's a good account, in fact, of the way in which there's a real stasis, in a sense, or a real hypothesization of change, despite the apparent churn at the level of discursive activity. Really, there's a distinct and strong continuity of structure, and of a kind of nothing new under the sun, in a sense, in some regions of discursive activity.
Just let me interject really quickly. I mean, in logics of worlds, you have already that in a certain sense. Like,
well, this
is the world. I mean,
that's a world. Yes, yeah. But obviously, then on the right Salesian side, they want to give an account of the purchase or the encounter of this kind of discursivity with a notion of the real, which is obviously the purview within Badiou of the event and the subject and truth, which you're right, intercede in, but are no means constitutive for a world at all. You can have a kind of presentation of beings in a world without any notion of touching the outside, so-called like atonic worlds.
Yeah, like modification, like the first form of change is the change within a world.
Yes. And
so I take it that you don't think there's a contribution to be.
Well, no, because
gain actually.
but the way but the contribution that there is to be made is that Badiou doesn't think about a world in terms of individual discursive experience. He thinks about a world in terms of this asubjective mode. There's no, like, this kind of Hallward criticism is kind of correct. Like, there's no account of what might be called like empirical individual experience or traversal of the world in that respect. Whereas Brandon wants to give that kind of account, right, about how, from the inside, right, what is it like to be in a world as an individual, right?
Yeah. This was kind of my project in the SCP that nobody cared much about. Okay.
Yeah.
I hope you think it's related. I have a very similar kind of question about when we get into the nitty-gritty of this individuated, let's say, or subjective territory or intersubjective territory of, let's call it, in the old school words, of interpretative communities and whatnot. And I think it's really interesting that you bring this up, because there isn't an account of that, right? And so what could that add? And my kind of like pseudo question, if you like, or point is to ask you to, I wonder what you think about how as soon as, I mean, the difference between what is a collective consciousness and what is a description of what is common, right? So Brandom, or whomever we could think of, there's other people too, could describe what is common in terms of structuring what is a description of an intersubjective or interpretive community. And even though that description might involve examples of people doing some interpretive work with each other, it remains a description of a common condition, but it might not access the complexity of that subjective, those acts that you might want to get at, because it still remains a kind of transcendental argument. So I don't know if this is making sense, but it kind of like collapses a little bit in the very act of making the claim, because it struggles to account for the distinction that it's holding between a description that is common, like a scientific description, let's say, and the idea of what a collective is in a political sense, right? Like a kind of understanding of collectivity and what consciousness might be. And, you know, in Badiou, while we don't have an account of those discursive interpretive communities, what we do have is an account of a common collective consciousness at the level of the event and impossibility and so on. So,
Yeah.
not sure.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. I didn't quite understand the thing of this notion of the discursive versus the common, but what you said about Badiou is interesting, because certainly for Badiou, I mean, he talks about thought, he talks about the subject, he even talks in Logics of Worlds about the body, but this is not at all for him to be located at the level of the individual human animal, as he calls it. And there is this strange naturalist, just tons of phrase in Badiou on that level. And there's a notion that, yeah, what he calls a subject is more often than not something that traverses or collects or operates at a different level from the individual human animal. But yeah, there's some sense where this kind of activity of giving registering that, understanding the relationship, and Badiou does have words for this. I mean, he calls certainly the relationship of a kind of individual to be committed into a mode of subjectivity, ideation, which is really the idea, is the kind of way of the articulation between this human animal, the empirical individual, that he has very little to say about, really, and the real subjective work, which is in some sense not to be talked about or can't be addressed at the level of the discursive activities, perhaps even of individuals, even if they are together in a group in a science sense. Yeah. Thank you, though.